is that it's important to keep in mind that, like, when the petrodollar system has been, the standard for keeping the dollar the global, or reserve currency, the U.S. has gone to war and like killed millions of people to defend that. One of the likely motivations, obviously there's more than one, but one of the key ones in invading Iraq, I would argue, was the fact that Saddam Hussein, not long before the invasion, had started selling oil in euros instead of dollars and made a lot more money, showing by example to other, other OPEC members that they could make more money selling in different currencies than.
2 days, one president, and Bitcoin's mood flipped 180 degrees. Bitcoin turned positive on Monday after President Donald Trump voiced his support for crypto. But that was Monday. Today tells a completely different story. The same president who called himself a big crypto guy on Monday sent crypto markets in the opposite direction just 2 days later, this time by threatening to restart a war. Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin sat down with Peter McCormick to break down exactly how Bitcoin reacted.
Okay, so in the case of like U.S. intelligence, if you go back to the very beginning, and there's even CIA like deputy directors that have said that, it was all Wall Street people at the beginning. It was Wall Street lawyers, it was Wall Street bankers, and since that point, from the genesis of the CIA, there's been revolving doors between CIA and Wall Street that have continued up until today. And really, you could look at the CIA as a public-private enterprise in some sense. It's a public security agency, but it's more or less functioned throughout its history as Wall Street's secret police. That's why its earliest coups, for example, like its first coup in Guatemala, was done on behalf of United Fruit. A major multinational corporation headquartered in the United States, which interestingly enough was later acquired by Leon Black's father and then Leslie Wexner's business mentor. And then you also have, the coup in Iran over like Anglo-American oil, like them losing their holdings there. The coup in 1973 in Chile, you can argue it was because of efforts to nationalize copper and all these largely Western mining companies losing out, and then they come in and do a coup and what have you. It's really been symbiotic for some time. And I think, as we moved into the information age, the CIA saw an opportunity. Well, let me back up a little bit. The internet from the very beginning was, it originally started as ARPANET, a project of the Pentagon. And for anyone that really wants to know about that history, I would highly recommend the book Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. It was essentially created in Vietnam as a counterinsurgency program. That was the goal of it, by the same people that were involved in things like the Phoenix program, which was the first instance of military intelligence, at least U.S. military intelligence, using databases to come up with names of dissidents and then assassinating them. And a lot of them weren't actually dissidents, like suspected dissidents or neighbors of dissidents and all of this stuff. And then from Phoenix program, it goes, all these CIA-backed dictatorships, like, Pinochet in Chile, for example, Operation Condor, use the exact same system. And they've been building these systems with the internet even before the modern internet as we use it now existed. And so a lot of these there were efforts early on to king-make the companies who would come to dominate the internet. And that has happened. It's just a matter of public record. If you look at the biggest companies in big tech, I've done work about how Facebook was essentially launched as a resurrection of a failed DARPA program called LifeLog by the same person that resurrected the failed DARPA program, Total Information Awareness, one of the most insane surveillance proposals ever in U.S. history, resurrected as Palantir. You can thank Peter Thiel for that, co-founder of PayPal. And a lot of these other companies that have become huge, Google, for example, there's a good article by Nafez Ahmed written on by Insert when he published at Insert Intelligence called "How the CIA Made Google." If you look at a lot of these companies, you will find intelligence agencies at the beginning. Palantir, I mentioned earlier, took In-Q-Tel money, developed very closely with the CIA. It began at PayPal. It's a PayPal spinoff, Palantir is. Oracle, another huge company in Silicon Valley. Larry Ellison, before he started Oracle, was working on Project Oracle at the CIA on databases, and was the infrastructure for Oracle as we know it now. A lot of these, there's been a lot of symbiosis between intelligence agencies and these big companies for a long time, and they couldn't have done it without venture capital. And that's arguably why the CIA launched In-Q-Tel in the late 90s, because they wanted to become big players in Silicon Valley. Because when you decide, who the kingmakers are, well, there's a lot of things actually to be said about that. So what I mentioned earlier about like total information awareness, this is a program that was just deemed so insane in the early 2000s that essentially every mainstream media publication railed against it, and rights group railed against it. But then when they relaunched the same program essentially as a private entity, as a private sector entity, no one complained. And so the CIA for a long time, and other intelligence agencies have followed this exact playbook, specifically Israeli intelligence. When you move into the private sector, you can get away with a lot more than you can in the public sector sometimes, depending on what you're trying to do. And so there have been efforts to do that, I would argue, for a very long time. And if you look at how these big tech companies have developed, and, for example, revelations from the Snowden leaks, just like how the extent to which these private companies, how much of your data that they're selling or passing to U.S. intelligence for warrantless surveillance. I mean, they've been collaborators of this for a very, very long time. And I think there really hasn't been enough scrutiny of that. And I would really argue that a lot of these companies operate more often than not as intelligence fronts. And it's kind of gotten to the point, too, where in U.S. specifically, the people behind these very big tech, the biggest of the big tech companies, are also the main donors to the two U.S. political parties. Right. You have like Peter Thiel on the Republican side, you have Reid Hoffman on the Democrat side, and Eric Schmidt on the Democrat side. I mean, they fund our politicians and they dominate our private sector infrastructure, especially as we've been forced to be more online, specifically since the COVID era. And the goal is to have things digitalize even further and have it all be on these people's systems and have us become completely dependent on their infrastructure. And these people are in bed with intelligence. And even aside from the intelligence connections, they have a lot of dirty laundry. Why did Jeffrey Epstein have connections with almost every big tech oligarch in the United States? I mean, not enough people have bothered to ask that question. Why were so many of them subpoenaed during the JP Morgan Epstein case in the US Virgin Islands that ended up being settled? I forget how much JP Morgan paid to make it all go away, but a lot of money.
What you just heard is Webb explaining that the U.S. went to war in Iraq because Saddam Hussein had started selling oil in euros, and that Gaddafi was overthrown partly because he was building a gold-backed African currency that threatened dollar dominance. Before that, Goodwin laid out how the Bitcoin dollar system replicates the exact mechanics of the petrodollar. You have to buy dollars to buy Bitcoin. The on-ramps are dollar-denominated, and stablecoin issuers are now the 18th largest buyers of U.S. Treasury debt. Put both arguments together, and it explains why Bitcoin dropped 3% the moment Trump said the Iran ceasefire was over. Coming up next, Webb's documented breakdown of what Tether actually is, why its FBI partnership matters, and how it functions as a financial weapon of dollar hegemony, not the banking the in-banked tool it markets itself as.
I absolutely see what you're saying, but I think, people that actually follow and read my work on Epstein, so I would argue there has been an effort from the day he was arrested in 2019 to frame the spectrum of Epstein discussions specifically about the sex trafficking and the abuse. And Epstein's career was much larger than that. I have argued consistently that more than anything else, Epstein was involved in shadow banking, suspect currency trading, and was arguably really a financial terrorist.
Okay. Just
as much as he was a sex trafficker. So I would argue that a lot of the connections, mainly in like for example, in his Black Book of contacts that is publicly available, for example, a lot of those I would argue are based around a lot of these financial connections. Some of them are not. So if you look at the Black Book, Epstein's butler went around and circled names of people who were involved explicitly, according to him, in the sex trafficking stuff. And most of the names are not circled, right? So when I say Epstein connected, I hope that people understand or have taken the time to either read my work or watch my interviews on Epstein, because I've explicitly said that not everyone associated with Epstein is a pedophile, and people have tried to do that and make Epstein pedophile only, right? And obviously he was that, but he was a lot more than that. And I think, the fact that there's been so little interest, for example, in his documented role in the collapse of Bear Stearns in 2008, his role in money laundering in connection with banks like BCCI, which were also sex trafficking prepubescent kids for elites of the Emirates in the 1980s and stuff. There's been no interest in looking into that kind of stuff, no interest in looking at his ties with big tech, for example, his efforts to rebrand as a big tech and also fintech investor. And in the case of Brock Pierce and Epstein, this happened after his first arrest, the meeting. And Pierce has said that all of his conversations with Epstein were related directly to cryptocurrency. So someone like Epstein, and with the financial history of Epstein, his interest arguably in cryptocurrency is to continue to engage in the same criminal and bad financial behavior that he had done for the decades prior. So whatever he was talking to Pierce about from Epstein's motives would have been to find ways to use cryptocurrency or help develop and guide the cryptocurrency industry in ways that would help enable the activity that he had consistently engaged in for decades and decades and decades. Yeah. Was Pierce willingly enabling that? I don't know, but I think, it's worth asking those questions, because in the past, like in the case of Din, he's kept questionable company. Was he an abuse victim? And in that gray area, it's quite possible. I've argued in the case of Ghislaine Maxwell that she sort of could potentially have fallen in that category as well, because I think there is some evidence that she was abused by her father, Robert Maxwell, in that way. And then sort of he died, and she sort of, instead of him being her, handler, I guess you could say, she's sent to Epstein, who, is alleged to have worked with Robert Maxwell in intelligence-related financial stuff in the 1980s. And then she, basically becomes the person helping him arrange his stuff and basically serving a lot of the same purposes that she helped her father do, but instead it's with Epstein.
Bitcoin dropped 3% today after Trump said the Iran ceasefire is over. Meanwhile, in the UK, a Tether stakeholder handed £5 million to the leader of Reform UK, who then went to the Bank of England and pushed for policies that would benefit his donor's business. Webb and Goodwin's work, documented in this interview, connects both dots. The Bitcoin dollar system is structured just like the petrodollar, which is why the U.S. defends it the same way it once defended oil, and why instability in the Middle East moves Bitcoin's price. Tether, which Goodwin shows is the 18th largest holder of U.S. Treasury debt, is not a neutral financial tool. It has onboarded the FBI and Secret Service. Its own head has publicly said Tether is committed to expanding U.S. dollar hegemony globally. And now, a Tether stakeholder is funding a political party in the UK that's advocating for its deregulation. Read the full Bloomberg and Guardian coverage, link below. The complete interview is available on What Bitcoin Did. Subscribe. We'll keep tracking this story as both the Iran situation and the Tether political financing developments unfold.